I was house-sitting for my aunt while she was out of town for a week. She lived in one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods, the kind where nothing ever happens, where people leave their doors unlocked, and the loudest thing at night is the wind rustling the trees. It was the kind of neighborhood that felt safe, almost too safe, like nothing bad could ever happen there, which, looking back now, makes what happened even worse. The first couple of nights were normal. I fed her cat, watered her plants, and spent the evenings binging TV shows on her massive flat screen. The house was a little creaky, but it was an old place, and I didn't think much of it. But on the third night, things started to feel off. It was around 11 p.m. I was curled up on the couch, the cat snoozing at my feet, when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against one of the windows. I muted the TV, straining to listen. The tapping stopped. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then, about 15 minutes later, it started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more deliberate, like someone was gently rapping their knuckles against the glass. My skin prickled. The cat suddenly perked up, its ears flicking toward the noise, its body tense. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I got up and walked toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The living room faced the front yard, with a large bay window overlooking the quiet street. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the curtain. Part of me didn't want to look. Part of me knew that whatever was out there, I didn't want to see it. But curiosity, and maybe a little bravado, got the best of me. I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Just the empty yard bathed in the soft glow of the streetlight. The wind was still. The neighborhood was silent. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a little silly for getting so worked up. I closed the curtain and turned to head back to the couch. That's when I saw it. A face, pressed up against the back window. I froze. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. The face was pale, almost grey, with wide, unblinking eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque, unnatural smile. It was staring directly at me, its breath fogging up the glass. I stumbled backward, my heart racing so fast I thought it might explode. The cat hissed, its back arched, fur standing on end. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the face was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body trembling, my mind spinning. Was it a prank? Some lunatic messing with me? I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called the police. I could barely get the words out, but they told me to stay on the line and that they'd send someone over immediately. While I waited, I locked every door and window in the house, double and triple checking each one. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The minutes dragged on like hours, until finally, I saw the flashing red and blue lights outside. 2 officers showed up and did a sweep of the property. They didn't find anyone, but they did find something else. Muddy footprints, leading all around the house, stopping at every window. The officer came back inside, his face pale, his hand resting on his holster, like he was expecting something worse. "Looks like someone's been circling the place for a while," he said. "But here's the thing. There are no footprints leading away." That's when the fear really sank in. The police stayed with me while I packed an overnight bag, and I ended up crashing at a friend's place for the rest of the week. But here's the part that still keeps me up at night. A few days later, when my aunt got back, she called me. Her voice was shaking. She told me that when she went to clean the guest bedroom, the one I had been sleeping in, she found something that didn't belong. Under the bed was a knife and a crumpled note. It said, "Thanks for leaving the window unlocked." Story 2. A few years ago, I went camping with 3 of my closest friends deep in the woods of northern Oregon, way off the beaten path, far from any hiking trails or campgrounds, in a place where the trees grew so thick they blocked out most of the moonlight, casting everything in this eerie, bluish-black shadow. We had picked the spot because we wanted to be alone, to get away from everything, to experience the kind of silence you can only find when you're miles from the nearest person. The first day was perfect. We set up camp near a small clearing, built a fire, and spent the evening drinking, laughing, and telling ghost stories like we were kids again. But when night fell and the fire started to die down, the woods around us felt different. The trees seemed closer somehow, the darkness heavier, pressing in from all sides. We chalked it up to the drinks and the stories, but even the sounds of the forest felt wrong, like the usual chirping of insects and rustling of leaves had faded into an unnatural stillness. It was around 2 a.m. when we first heard it, the unmistakable sound of a baby crying, faint but clear, echoing through the trees. We froze, exchanging confused looks. At first, we thought it had to be someone else camping nearby, maybe a family we hadn't noticed earlier. But the crying wasn't coming from any nearby campsite. It was coming from deeper in the woods, far off the path, where there shouldn't have been anyone. My friend Mark immediately grabbed his flashlight, saying we should check it out in case someone needed help. But something in my gut twisted, and I told him we should stay put. I couldn't explain it, but the sound, it didn't feel right. It wasn't just that it was out of place. There was something off about it. The way the cry echoed, the rhythm of it. It almost sounded like it was repeating, like a recording stuck on a loop. But Mark wouldn't listen. He was already heading toward the tree line, his flashlight cutting thin beams through the darkness, and after a moment, the rest of us reluctantly followed. The closer we got, the clearer the crying became, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The sound wasn't moving. It wasn't coming closer or farther away. It was just there, fixed in one spot, like it was waiting. We called out, "Hello? Is anyone there? Do you need help?" But the crying didn't change. It just kept going, this eerie, hollow wail that didn't sound quite human anymore. Mark was about 20 feet ahead of us when he suddenly stopped, his flashlight frozen on something in the distance. "Guys," he whispered, his voice trembling, "you need to see this." We hurried up behind him, and what I saw next will haunt me for the rest of my life. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a small wooden cradle, old and weathered, swaying slightly as if it had just been touched, even though there was no wind. The crying was coming from inside it. But when Mark stepped forward and shined his flashlight directly into the cradle, the sound stopped. The cradle was empty, completely, utterly empty. No baby, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, heavier than anything I'd ever felt before. We all stood there, frozen, trying to process what we were seeing, or rather, what we weren't seeing. And then, out of nowhere, the crying started again, but this time, it was behind us. We spun around, our flashlights scanning the trees, but there was nothing there, just the same dense woods and suffocating darkness. The crying grew louder, closer, and that's when it changed. It wasn't a baby anymore. The sound warped, twisted, becoming something deeper, more guttural, like a voice trying to mimic a baby's cry, but failing miserably, the edges of the sound cracking into a kind of harsh, raspy laughter. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard, I thought it might explode. Without saying a word, we all bolted back toward the campsite, stumbling over roots and branches, our flashlights bouncing wildly in the dark. But the laughter followed us, growing louder, more distorted, like it was coming from every direction at once. When we finally burst back into the clearing where our tents were, we didn't stop to catch our breath. We grabbed whatever we could carry, doused the fire, and sprinted to the car, not daring to look back. The entire time, I felt like something was right behind me, just inches away, waiting for me to trip, to fall, to give it a reason to grab me. We peeled out of there, driving way too fast down the narrow dirt road, and even when we were miles away, we could still hear that twisted laughter echoing faintly in the distance. We didn't stop until we hit the highway, and none of us spoke a word the entire way home. But here's the part that still gives me chills. The next day, when we went online to see if there had been any reports of missing campers or strange sightings in that area, we found out that the woods we had been in were notorious for disappearances. Hikers and campers who had gone missing over the years, their bodies never found. Locals whispered about some kind of entity that lured people deeper into the forest by mimicking the sound of a crying baby, only to drag them into the darkness once they were alone. I don't know what we heard that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is we were lucky to get out of there, and I'll never ever go camping in those woods again. Story 3. Back when I was in college, I rented a cheap apartment off campus, the kind of place you find when you're broke and desperate, not really caring about how run down it is, as long as the rent is low and the utilities work. The building itself was old, with creaky floors and thin walls that let in every sound from the neighbors, but I didn't mind. I was just glad to have my own space. It wasn't in the best neighborhood, but I told myself it was temporary, just until I graduated and could afford something better. The first few weeks were uneventful. I got used to the late-night sirens and the occasional shouting from the street below. But then, one night, after getting home from a late shift at work, I noticed something strange. It was just a feeling at first, a subtle shift in the air as I walked through the door, like the apartment was too quiet, too still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I shook it off, blaming it on exhaustion, but as I moved through the apartment, turning on lights and dropping my stuff by the door, that uneasy feeling stuck with me. I double-checked the locks, even though I knew I had locked the door behind me, and went about my usual routine, making a quick dinner, scrolling through my phone, and eventually getting ready for bed. But the entire time, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. It was the kind of creeping paranoia that settles deep in your chest, irrational, but impossible to ignore. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, but when I finally climbed into bed, the feeling only intensified. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the old building amplified in the silence. I told myself to stop being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffling sound, coming from somewhere in the room. My heart started to pound. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. I sat up, my eyes scanning the dark room, every shadow suddenly looking like it was hiding something. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the building settling, but the fear gnawed at me. I got out of bed and checked the apartment, flicking on every light, looking in the closet, behind the shower curtain, even under the couch. Nothing. Everything was exactly as it should be. But when I got back to the bedroom, I hesitated. There was one place I hadn't checked. One place I couldn't bring myself to look. Under the bed. I don't know why, but the thought of looking under there filled me with a deep, primal dread, like some part of me already knew I wouldn't like what I found. I stood there for a long time, my heart racing, trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous. Eventually, I shook it off and slid back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin and forcing my eyes shut. I told myself I was safe, that nothing was wrong, but I barely slept that night. When morning finally came, I felt foolish for how scared I'd been. The sunlight made everything seem normal again, and I laughed at myself as I got ready for class. But when I bent down to grab my shoes from under the bed, my heart stopped. Sitting on the floor, right where I would have seen it the night before, was a small, crumpled note. My hands trembled as I picked it up, my stomach twisting into knots. Scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting were the words, "Thanks for not looking under the bed." My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. There was no way. I had locked the doors. I had checked the apartment. No one could have been in there. But that note, it was real. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my phone, my wallet, and ran out of that apartment as fast as I could. I didn't even bother to lock the door behind me. I went straight to the campus security office and told them everything. They called the police, and when the officers arrived, they searched the apartment from top to bottom. At first, they didn't find anything. But then one of the officers called me over, his face pale. He pointed to the small crawl space in the back of my closet, a space I didn't even know existed. The door was slightly ajar. When they opened it, they found signs that someone had been living there. A ratty sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, and a small collection of my things that had gone missing over the past few weeks. But the worst part? They found a knife tucked neatly under the sleeping bag. The police said whoever it was had probably been sneaking in and out of my apartment for days, maybe even weeks, hiding whenever I came home, waiting for the right moment. I moved out that same day, left everything behind. But to this day, I can't sleep without checking under the bed, because every time I close my eyes, I wonder what would have happened if I had looked that night. Or worse, what would have happened if I hadn't. Story 4. A couple of years ago, I was driving home late at night from a friend's house, taking an old country road that cut through miles of empty fields and dense patches of forest. It was one of those roads where the trees crowd the edges, leaning in like they're trying to swallow the pavement whole, and the only light comes from your own headlights because there aren't any streetlights for miles. I'd driven this road 100 times before, but that night felt different. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl, like the whole world is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had my windows down, trying to shake off the feeling, but the cool night air did nothing to calm me. About 20 minutes into the drive, I saw him, a man standing on the side of the road, right at the edge of my headlight's reach. He was wearing dark clothes, old and tattered, like they were from another time. Something about the way he was dressed looked like he'd stepped out of the 1950s. His head was down, his face hidden by the brim of an old hat, and he had his thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. Normally, I wouldn't stop for a stranger, especially not that late at night on a deserted road, but something about him made me slow down. I can't explain it. It was like I wasn't in control, like some part of me was curious, even though my gut screamed at me to keep driving. But as I got closer, something felt off. He wasn't moving. He didn't look up. He just stood there, perfectly still, like a statue. My headlights hit him full on, and that's when I realized his clothes were soaking wet, clinging to his body like he'd just crawled out of a lake. That's when the fear really hit me. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped past him, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I told myself it was nothing, just some weird guy on the side of the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then, a few miles down the road, I saw him again, standing on the side of the road. Same spot, same clothes, same blank, lifeless posture. My stomach dropped. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. There were no turn-offs, no shortcuts, nothing but that long, empty road stretching behind me. I was going at least 60 miles per hour. Even if he'd had a car, he couldn't have passed me without me seeing it. But there he was, standing in the exact same position, like he'd never moved. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white, and pressed the gas harder, my speed creeping up as I tried to shake the growing sense of dread clawing at my chest. But no matter how fast I went, no matter how far I drove, I kept seeing him, over and over again. Every couple of miles there he was, standing on the side of the road, his head down, thumb out, as if he was waiting for me to stop. The thing is, he never looked at me, not once, but somehow I felt like he was watching me. I don't know how to explain it. It was like his presence was inside my head, like I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. The farther I drove, the worse it got. The air in the car felt heavier, like I was suffocating, and the trees outside the window seemed to blur together, the road stretching on longer than it should have. It was like I was driving through some kind of loop, stuck in the same stretch of road no matter how far I went. I was sweating, my heart racing, my mind spiraling with panic. I just wanted to get home, to get off that road, but it felt like the road wasn't going to let me leave. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't on the side of the road anymore. He was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the pavement, the car skidding to a stop just a few feet from him. My headlights illuminated his face for the first time, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. His skin was pale and bloated, his eyes wide open and glassy, staring straight at me, and his mouth, God, his mouth, was twisted into this grotesque, unnatural grin that stretched too wide, like his skin was about to tear. Water was dripping from his clothes, pooling on the road beneath him, and as I sat there, frozen, unable to breathe, I realized something that made my heart stop. His feet weren't touching the ground. He was floating, just a few inches above the pavement, swaying slightly like he was being held up by invisible strings. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone, just vanished into thin air. I sat there for what felt like forever, my hands glued to the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally got the courage to start the car again, I didn't stop until I was home, and even then, I sat in the driveway for a long time, too afraid to get out of the car, convinced that if I looked in the rearview mirror, I'd see him sitting in the back seat. The next day, I told my dad what happened, thinking maybe he'd have some explanation, some rational reason for what I saw. But when I finished, his face went pale. He told me that years ago, a man had drowned on that road after his car veered off into a nearby lake. Ever since, people driving that stretch at night had reported seeing a hitchhiker, always the same description, always the same blank stare. They say he's trying to hitch a ride home, but no one ever gets him there. And some people, they never make it home at all. Story 5. When I was a kid, my family moved into an old house in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the houses have histories longer than anyone living in them. The house we moved into was big, creaky, and full of strange little quirks. Floorboards that groaned even when no one was walking on them, doors that never seemed to stay shut, and cold drafts that would snake through the rooms even in the middle of summer. But the thing that creeped me out the most wasn't any of that. It was the bathroom mirror. It was this old, ornate thing, way too fancy for a house like that, with a heavy gold frame that was tarnished and chipped in places. The glass itself wasn't smooth like modern mirrors. It had tiny imperfections, little ripples and bubbles that made your reflection look just a little off, like you were staring at a version of yourself from some twisted parallel world. At first, it was just a feeling. When I'd brush my teeth or wash my face, I'd get this weird sense that something was watching me. Not like someone standing behind me, but from the mirror itself, like the reflection wasn't really me, but something else pretending to be me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then I started noticing things. Subtle at first, like I'd look away from the mirror, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd swear I saw my reflection keep moving for just a split second longer than it should have. Or sometimes, when I walked past the bathroom with the door open, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the mirror, even though no one was in there. I tried to ignore it, but it got worse. One night, I was getting ready for bed, standing in front of the mirror, when I saw it clearly for the first time. As I was brushing my teeth, my reflection stopped moving. My hand was still scrubbing back and forth, but in the mirror, my reflection was perfectly still, just staring at me with this blank, almost bored expression. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, toothbrush still in my mouth, and just stared back at it, waiting to see if it would move. After what felt like forever, my reflection's lips curled into this slow, twisted smile, but I wasn't smiling. I dropped the toothbrush and bolted out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. I told my parents, but they laughed it off, said I'd been watching too many scary movies. I wanted to believe they were right, but after that night, I refused to go into that bathroom alone. But the mirror wasn't done with me. Things escalated. I'd find things in the bathroom that I knew I hadn't left there. My toys, random objects from around the house, even things from my room that I knew I hadn't touched in days. It was like the mirror was pulling things in, or worse, bringing things out. The worst night of my life happened about a month after we moved in. I woke up in the middle of the night, the house dead silent, except for this faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It was soft, but steady, like someone lightly tapping their fingernail against glass. It took me a minute to realize it was coming from the bathroom. I lay there, frozen in my bed, staring at the dark hallway outside my door, the tapping getting louder, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I got up, creeping down the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, and the light inside was flickering, casting these weird, jerky shadows on the walls. I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside, and what I saw still haunts me to this day. My reflection was standing there, in the mirror, but I wasn't. I was standing in the doorway, but in the mirror, I was inside the bathroom, just staring at me, that same twisted smile stretched across its face. But that wasn't the worst part. The reflection started moving, toward the edge of the mirror. I watched in horror as it pressed its hands against the glass, then started pushing through, like the mirror was water and it was stepping into the real world. I slammed the door shut and ran back to my room, locking the door and hiding under the covers, too terrified to even breathe. I stayed like that until morning, when the sunlight finally felt like it could protect me. When I worked up the courage to check the bathroom the next day, everything looked normal. The mirror was just a mirror, but I knew better. After that, I refused to use that bathroom. My parents thought I was being ridiculous, but I didn't care. A few months later, we moved out of that house, and I thought I was free. But even now, years later, I still get that same sinking feeling whenever I'm alone in a bathroom. Sometimes, when I glance at the mirror, I swear I see something just out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, a shadow that doesn't belong. And every now and then, when the house is quiet and I'm the only one awake, I hear it again. That soft, steady tapping on the glass, like it's still there, waiting.